to see you keep walking.
So be on. I think the sound is coming.
There
you go. It's a very finicky setup we have here. But in any case, welcome to the museum. I'm glad you guys could come out this afternoon. We're going to be talking about the British Home Children, the British Home Children program, and kind of the impact that has had on Canada, the impact that's had on Kenora more locally. And then at the end, we're going to be looking at a little bit of a case study to kind of really bring it home and really talk about some of the local connections we have here. So just starting off, for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to give you the historical background that started the program, the reason why the program started. Hang on. Just going to put this guy right here, just so I'm definitely behind it. All right. So I'm going to be talking about the historical background that led to the sending of 100,000 kids to Canada. I'm going to be talking about some of the agencies that were involved, and with some of the emphasis on some of the major kind of players and some of the founding members of the British Home Child program. And then we're going to talk about, like I said, some kind of local connection here, and then we'll go from there. I think the issue is actually my mic, so you have to just bear with me. All right. Won't be able to move. That's okay. All right. So the Victorian England, I guess we kind of sometimes breeze right past why we call it Victorian England. Queen Victoria was the queen from 1838 to 1901, and that was really considered sort of the boom period of the British Empire. This was when you get the idea that the sun never set on the British Empire, and was really the high water mark. By the late 1800s, England was really in the later stages of what we call the Industrial Revolution. Again, we take it for granted, but just a few hundred years before this, there was no such thing as steam engines or kind of electricity, power, these sorts of things, and the change to society was considerable, to say the least. Steam power and other mechanical advances transformed the country into what was an agrarian backwater for much of it to one of the most powerful countries in the world. The image of Victorian England that we think of often is what you see here, kind of a scene maybe from Sherlock Holmes or A Christmas Carol. In the early 1800s, many of the tensions from the Industrial Revolution were actually starting to come to a head in England. People were starting to realize it wasn't all necessarily good things that were happening or necessarily good results. Traditionally, children would go to work with their parents on farms. They would work with, they would learn their dad's trade, they would learn kind of household rules from their mother. Rich kids would be sent off to school, maybe they'd be going off to seminary or university, and to kind of lead a life in academia. But the majority of people, the majority of sort of the middle class and the working class, and just the majority of people in general, were working and learning from their parents. During the Industrial Revolution, many former farmers were moving into cities, taking up jobs in mills, mines, and factories. It's worth remembering and worth kind of noting that public education in the UK wasn't publicly available until 1891. So it was not uncommon to see scenes like this. The tradition of children coming to work to help feed the family, help kind of support the family, followed the move into the city. So kids were working with their parents in the mills and factories. You can see this job right here. The average child worker started work around 8 years of age. The most common job for really little kids was called a piecer. So essentially what this fellow is doing is he's standing on a spinning machine and he's repairing breaks in the thread. So he's manually repairing them. The belt just to his side would have been spinning very fast. It was very, very dangerous work, and for children and adults alike. And a lot of the kids weren't necessarily forced to work. There was no one kind of going into the street and compelling them, like, you're coming with me and you're working in our factory. There was no sort of Dickensian sort of, we're bringing you to the factory. But there was many children were compelled to work to help support their family. And there was instances of orphans and certainly of kids who didn't have anyone to take care of them, where they certainly were compelled to go to Canada. That's why we're here today. Quite frankly, the conditions were pretty grim for these kids. Pretty grim for their parents as well. It was not necessarily a great time to be part of the working class. As I said before, schools were not provided at the taxpayer expense until 1891. And so for much of the sort of urbanization of the United Kingdom, there was just kids kind of running about. The idea of youth culture, something that we're kind of surrounded with now, was not a thing at all. Actually, youth culture as we know it didn't really develop until the 1930s. Large slums developed across the UK. Poor parents who are living in the country, who are working on farms, would send their kids into the cities to find better opportunity and to maybe better themselves, to kind of be part of the future, part of this kind of future movement of technology. In desperate acts, parents would often also send their kids to orphanages, again hoping for a better life. And you can see there's a couple young gals here working again. I think they're sewing some fabric there. So as a result of the lack of public schooling, as a result of the working class really being taken up in the Industrial Revolution and the lack of protections for the working class, there was a lot of kids who were just kind of hanging out on the street all day. That's where you get, again, the Oliver Twist, the kind of Dickensian street waif. This led to a lot of them getting into trouble. They were acting like kids, which is to the great horror of many Victorians. They were kind of causing a nuisance or getting into all sorts of trouble. Combine that with parents who are working in factories and mills, working 12-hour days at best, or at worst, either drunk or dead. So child vagrancy was a major issue in cities in the United Kingdom. Just a really great shot of a Victorian street here. The idea of sending poor people to Canada was actually a pretty old idea by the time it actually happened. The first real sort of person who vocalized this was a fellow named Robert Chambers. He was a police magistrate in Southwark in London. He testified to a parliamentary committee in April of 1826. His direct quote says, "The directors and guardians of the poor highly approve of any plan of sending children to Canada. They are now in the workhouses. 56 boys and 25 girls between the ages of 12 and 20, and a great number under the age whom they will be just as much at loss to provide for as the others." So they're talking about these mostly teens, actually, what he's talking about, but there's also young kids as well that are living under the care of guardians, so they have no parents to take care of them. That's where the home comes from, in the British home child, because they worked they were sent to these poor homes or guardian homes or industrial homes or these places where they would be taken care of, ideally in a good way, but again, that's not always the case. Between the 1830s and the 1860s, there were many new ideas on how to reform society, and many sort of kind of new ways of thinking that were sort of bandied about. This is when we saw the origins and the rise of the temperance movement, for example. People saw the working class kind of drowning their sorrows in alcohol, and they thought, if we can only get rid of alcohol, then people will be happy, not realizing that alcohol was a symptom and not the disease. That's also when we see the scientific ideas of Charles Darwin, survival of the fittest, and those kind of ideas sort of being abused and applied to society kind of more generally. So-called social Darwinism was the idea that the strong survive. Therefore, people who have power and influence must be doing something right. And by extension, the people who are poor, marginalized, and oppressed, they're probably doing something wrong. And so people would look around and say, well, we're the British Empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. In order to be a good model citizen, you must be a good model Englishman. And this is also a lot of where the thinking of residential schools comes from as well. The solution was imposing the strong ideas onto the weak. The line of thinking, like I said, also the roots of the Canadian Indian residential school system was also in the same line of thinking. That's why you also saw a huge boom of missionary work in this time period as well, and missionary societies in the Victorian era. If you look at many of the major kind of missionary societies that are around today, you'll see they're all started basically in the 1840s and 1850s. Very, very common stuff. There was also kind of an idea that the inner city and cities more generally, urban life, was evil to one's health, and that being in nature was the only real true kind of healthy way of life, and it was not only good for you physically, but it was also good for you morally as well. The idea of the just frontiersman taking on nature and all that nature can throw at him and kind of bending it to his will was idealized in culture. Carving out a life in the wilderness, in this case in Canada, was seen as not, like I said, not just a physical good thing, but also a moral act as well. All the while, social issues in the cities persisted. This is actually an image, it's a cartoon from the 1850s. It's an image of a young boy being sold by his mother to work as a chimney sweep. And you can see there's a young fellow just behind him. He's gathering up his stuff and he's going off to work. And this young fellow just at the feet of the chimney sweep, basically looking to take this young guy away. So everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, it was a very common idea, it was a very common belief that something needed to change and there needed to be relief from what was going on. So in addition to missionary societies, there's a number of children's aid organizations popping up in the UK as well. The Children's Friend Society for the Prevention of Juvenile Vagrancy was one such group. They opened up industrial homes and charities for orphans and destitute children. The idea was to get them off the street and into the classroom and also get them religious training. Organizations like the Female Middle Class, this is the actual name of the organization, and it's really quite something. The Female Middle Class Emigration Society was organized by a woman named Maria Rye, and that organization sent young ladies all over the Commonwealth in pursuit of husbands. So that was something she did. What she would do is she would collect up 8 or 9 young ladies who said, right, we would like husbands, and she said, no problem, we're going to Australia. So they'd jump in a boat and off they'd go, and she would escort them to Australia and essentially play matchmaker, and that was her gig. So by the time the 1850s and 1860s rolled around, people were starting to see that maybe this wasn't the best, and Maria Rye started kind of looking to other ways to kind of impose her help on society. So Maria Rye is the person who really got the British Home Child program off the ground in earnest. This is Maria right here. By the late 1860s, it had become prohibitively expensive to ship these middle-class women around the world. So she started looking elsewhere where she could help, and she turned her focus on the children of London. In 1869, Maria Rye purchased a surplus courthouse in Niagara-on-the-Lake. The home was later become known as Our Western Home. That year, Maria Rye accompanied 73 children, mostly young girls, to Canada to live in Our Western Home. And this was the beginning of the British Home Child program as we know it. Children were brought to Canada from orphanages, from poorhouses, from industrial homes in Britain. Once they were in Canada, they would stay at the depot houses like Our Western Home, and then they would be sent to live and work with a family in Canada. That was sort of the ideal sort of situation. That's what they sort of believed would be best. This scheme was supported by both the British Board of Guardians and by the Government of Canada. This is where we get the term home children, like I said, because they came from state or institutional homes, like orphan homes, industrial homes, etc. The children were welcomed to Canada for a number of reasons. First and foremost, they were English-speaking Protestants, and that was extremely attractive to the Government of Canada at the time because they were loyal to the Crown and they were seen as a population that could backfill places like Quebec and help those places become more English. This was especially popular, like I said, in French Catholic areas like Quebec and the Maritimes. At the time, jurisdiction for immigration actually fell to the Department of Agriculture. from their perspective, the idea of getting young boys and girls to work on farms in Canada was great. More people to work, more food to make, and more people to build up. So in this ideal world, this is how the scheme would go. Older women, older girls rather, would be trained in housekeeping. They would work in exchange for room and board. Once old enough, they would have all the tools necessary to be a wife and a mother. Older boys would be trained in a trade or industry, blacksmithing or cooperages and these sorts of things. They'd work as apprentices, and once they reach maturity, they would be able to join a guild or start a farm of their own. Younger children would be taught chores with the idea that the families would raise them as their own in a kind of adopted sense. That was the ideal sort of that people were thinking that the scheme would take on. Other agencies soon joined the scheme as well. This lady is Annie McPherson. She was a colleague of Maria Rye, and she partnered with her to bring the children to Canada. They partnered to bring 149 kids to Canada in 1870. The two combined to bring 451 in 1871. This other fellow, this kind of snidely whiplash-looking character, this is Dr. Thomas Barnardo. He wasn't actually a doctor, but he called himself a doctor. He was training to be a missionary when he saw the poor in London and stopped his studies to open a school and orphanage in the East End of London. Dr. Barnardo is very relevant to us for a number of reasons. First and foremost, his organization was one of the major groups that brought people over. It's also really important to us specifically in Kenora because there was a receiving home in Winnipeg and an industrial farm for the Barnardo boys in Russell, Manitoba. So oftentimes if you're doing research on this subject area, you'll hear people talk about the Barnardo boys. They came from the Barnardo group. That group actually still exists, actually, by the way. They still exist. All right. So whenever a scandal about a historical figure comes up, and we've seen this quite a bit in the last few years with John A. and whomever else, people like to remind us they need to be judged according to the standards of their time. I'm not sure why I did this, because I say that all the time. Anyway, well, they do. They need to be judged by the standards of their time. Well, even by the standards of their time, this program was extremely controversial, and often people saw it as a bad thing. This is a cartoon from 1869, the very first year the program ran. The cartoon was published in response to Maria Rye's first trip. So it says here, our gutter children, and they're literally scraping kids up off the street like they swept up manure. The text that went along with the pamphlet, or rather it depicts ministers and other aid workers literally shoving children into a mud wagon, which they used to clean the streets. And the text that went along with the pamphlet read in part, but this is really true that in this country, the most wealthy in the world, and the one that is the most Christian, how can it be true that there is such a large number of neglected and deserted boys and girls constantly growing up in misery and crime, so that it may, through a great act of Christian charity, to take infants thousands of miles from their native land, has glorious old England come at last to such a state as this, that she has to transport some of her innocent little girls like it transports her criminals, to send her to the shores of America and Canada, little girls to be white slaves as black slaves used to be sent from Africa when the horrible slave trade existed? Yes, it is unfortunately too true that there are in this Christian land hundreds of thousands of children in the United Kingdom growing up in pauperism and crime. So even at the time, people thought this was not a good idea. It was very controversial. People were looking at this and saying, this is going to be abused. Absolutely. These kids don't have any advocates. Kind of going on, there was a very scathing report to Parliament in 1875. A guy named Andrew Doyle. Well, here's a quote from Andrew Doyle. He said, he was speaking of the people who would bring in these home children in Canada. He said, first off, there's the people who apply from the highest motives. They have pity for the orphan and for the children. They have desire to be fellow workers with fellow Christians here and are desiring to lessen the amount of sin and suffering of the children of England. That class is very limited, but a large class still in Canada, as Christian works are necessarily limited in a country where there is very little sickness, no poverty or destitution. Number 2, there's also those who have married very young and whose children have followed their example and grown up. And they find themselves at a comparatively early age, say 45, childless and alone in life, and of wanting, of every sense in the world, a young child for whom their house will be a boon and a blessing. So there's that. There's number 2. Number 3, Andrew Doyle recounts, there are those who require children on account of their services and who are willing to take them on account for their future usefulness. From my observation and from inquiries that I have made, I'm afraid that those who apply for children from the very highest motives are a very small class indeed. I think the first and second class of applicants, taken together, may be dismissed as really not providing more than 10% for the young children that are sent out. There is indeed a very large class in Canada who require children on account of their services and who are willingly to take them on in account of their future usefulness. He goes on to talk about how the homes these kids are sent to are not being properly vetted. There's very little follow-up. In fact, he ends his report where he goes to talk to one of the home children, and the home child gets really excited and comes in and is disappointed because the kid thought it was going to be their former house mother who was coming to visit them. Because the adult who was there just said, there's someone here to see you. And so the kid was like, oh great, my house mother's here. And she ran in and it was Andrew Doyle and she was very disappointed. It's really quite a poignant scene. He talks about how there's very little follow-up. He mentions on the first cross-Atlantic journey, 3 of the girls got pregnant. So there's that as well. There's also the sexual abuse element. He also mentions there's a large number of cases being sent out to placements who are then being sent back and then sent out again and being sent back and sent out again and being sent back. He concludes the only way this program should continue if it's specifically for adopted kids for vetted parents. So if they are legitimately orphans and they're very young and the parents want to take them on as part of the family, then that would be okay. But anything else would be, they shouldn't be doing. This was in 1875, he was saying this. He's fully of the mind that anyone older than 7 or 8 shouldn't be sent to Canada, and absolutely of the mind that anyone over the age of 9 or 10 was basically just being used for their labor. So again, like I said, this was a contemporary report sent to Parliament and very, very clear in its meaning. There was 50 organizations that sent kids to Canada as part of the British Home Child Program. About 30% of the kids came from Dr. Barnardos. This is Hazelbrae House in Peterborough, Ontario. It was a receiving home for Dr. Barnardos. His actual organization was called the National Association for the Reclamation of Destitute Waif Children. But everyone just referred to it as Dr. Bernardo and Bernardo's homes. Right off the bat, there were issues, and over the next 20 years, there were 88 instances where Dr. Bernardo was personally accused of abducting children. Not only was he personally accused of abducting children, he didn't deny it. He confessed the charges to be true, and he referred to them as philanthropic abduction. So a situation where a kid would be taken away from their parents, the parents had no idea, and then after they were sent to Canada, the parents would get a letter saying, hey, your kid's in Canada now. So while the British Home Child Program was originally, the idea was to help orphans, only about 2% of the kids in the program were orphans. Organizations like Dr. Bernardo's home would literally abduct kids off the street that they thought were in a bad situation, so they would make the moral call that these kids, they got to come with us, and they would literally abduct them. Maybe their parents drank too much, were unemployed. In one case from Manitoba, an 8-year-old boy was taken from his mother and sent to a rural farm because she was a single mother who was dying of cancer and could no longer take care of him. Oftentimes, parents would only find out about a child being sent to Canada weeks after they were gone. And it was only in 1891 that parents could challenge these decisions. Even if they did challenge these decisions, they had to prove in court they were good parents and pay back the homes and institutions the cost of housing their child for the time the child was with them. So it was pretty awful. If you don't really have to think about it very long to realize how bad the program was. This is the Dr. Bernardo receiving home in Winnipeg, 85 Bannerman Avenue. Still there, private residence now, so don't drive by and throw bottles at her or anything. A big part of the reason why we know so much about Dr. Bernardo's work, again, because they're still actually around, and they kept pretty decent records, which you can now purchase. However, they were not above changing names, changing religions of kids, and basically switching around stats so that the kids who were sent to Canada couldn't be found. Dr. Bernardo was a talented showman. He was a charismatic figure, kind of in the mold of P.T. Barnum. That's essentially why he never faced any consequences for literally abducting children off the street. He would go in and he would say, yes, I did this, and he would give a big speech to the judge, and by the end of it, people would be crying and applauding. Another big reason was he used stunning before and after photos of the kids that he abducted. So he would use these stunning transformations as the basis for intervening in the lives of these kids. And some people bought it. Some people really ate it up. They believed in Dr. Bernardo and his ilk as moral reformers who, by hook or by crook, were going to clean up the streets. At this juncture, it's a worthy reminder to remind ourselves what C.S. Lewis wrote about moral reformers. He said, of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely expressed for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so at the approval of their own conscience. So that's a really good summary of kind of what's going on and kind of the moral aspect of this story. So between 1869 and the 1930s, as many as 100,000 kids were exported to Canada, mostly between the ages of 7 and 14. The program ended in earnest in 1948, rather. About 2/3 of the kids were boys. As I mentioned before, contrary to the original intention of the program, the majority of them were not orphans, nor were they all necessarily children of paupers. At least one agency shows that many were non-paupers and just abducted from kind of bad situations. Still others had room and board paid at their home, and in the UK they were not shipped out until their benefactor died or stopped payment. So someone was paying for the room and board and then that person died, so then they were sent off to Canada. Others were put in homes abroad simply because they were sick, and the homes offered the only free medical care. So if their kid was sick, parents would put their kids in there to maybe help them get better. Others were put in there by widowed or sick parents or by families who had fallen on hard times. Some were sent by parents who had no hope for their offspring in Britain or simply had no room for them at their home. Newspaper advertisements would alert farmers that a new shipment of children were coming to the distribution home, and they would come to the distribution home and size up the kids like you would size up people, or rather livestock at a market. They would select kids, they would make an application and take them home. There was no attempt to keep brothers and sisters together, and for every one child at the receiving homes, they generally received 7 applications. So it was very popular, especially in this part of the world where there are so many farms. So there were several British home children that came to Kenora, and I was hearing some people talk about some other ones as well. So this is from the Ups and Downs newsletter, which is the Bernardo home newsletter. It talks about Arthur Denham, and if you can read that, it says, Arthur Denham tells us, he was sent to Rat Portage in 1902. Arthur Denham tells us he's a great swimmer. He has lots of fun when he is through with his work, and pumps the organ at the English church, St. Albans, for which he receives the handsome remuneration of 50 cents per Sunday. So there you go. So Arthur Denham lived with a Mr. Mackenzie. Let's see here, as reported in the Ups and Downs, he was a bell ringer. He was 7 years old when he arrived in Rat Portage. The other names of the British home children that I know of from the Canadian Library and Archives Canada database are Arthur Meek and Frank Markham. There are 5 British home children in the Dryden area that were sent there originally, and one that I know of anyway in the Fort Francis area. These are 2 young fellows who didn't arrive in Kenora until after they were a little bit older. Thomas and Ernest Lusty were sent to Canada in 1905. They end up in separate farms in southern Manitoba, and we know Thomas bounced around to several farms in his youth. Both end up enlisting in World War I, enlisted to fight for Canada. Thomas and his family lived on the Reddit Road for after the war, and his daughter Emma is buried up at the Lake of the Woods Cemetery. The vast majority of children rather, who came to Canada were indentured by contract. They were placed in care and custody of farm families for whom they were bound by this kind of loose agreement. Up to the age of 10 or 12, children were supposed to just receive board and clothing and schooling. And then after that, they are meant to receive a small wage. Again, despite good intentions of people running the distributing homes, significant precautions were not taken to ensure that the children were kept safe. These kids didn't have an advocate. The applicant farmers were not necessarily screened. The children were not visited regularly by an inspector, despite the government requirements. Homes lost track of many of the children. The kids themselves lost track of their brothers and sisters. Some children were treated very kindly by their farm families, but in the very kind of broader experience, most written and oral accounts say that the kids were not treated very well, be it the endless drudgery, abuse. Sometimes they were brought in and set to work so that the farmers' kids could go to school, and so they would work and the kids of the family would go to school. There was physical and psychological abuse and presumably sexual abuse as well. They were inadequately clothed and fed. Few gained an education, and as many parents saw that the presence of a home child, like I said, gave their child an opportunity to go to school. An estimated 60,000, or about 2/3 of the children, were mistreated or abused. It's pretty safe to say, from my standpoint, that figure is conservative. What we know about people. Like I said, these kids had no advocates, and their treatment reflects that. It's really quite sad. A great stigma was also attached to the idea of being a home child. They perceived themselves and were perceived as from society as being rejects or discarded from the British Empire, British Isles. In the book Anne of Green Gables, one of the characters, Marilla Cuthbert, says, "At first Matthew suggested a homeboy, but I said no flat to that. They may be all right, I'm not saying they're not, but no London street Arabs for me. I said, give me a native born at least. There'll be a risk no matter what we get, but I'll feel easier in my mind and sleep sounder at night if we get someone who's born in Canada." So this is very, very common, so common in fact that it found its way into Lucy Maud Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables, and people who were reading it contemporarily would certainly have understood what she was talking about. To be frank, these societies saw these kids as disposable, and the program really treated them as such. The program did start to wind down in the 1920s. There was a British government report in 1924 that recommended only kids 14 years of age and older be sent to the Commonwealth. The program was slowed down considerably in 1930. There was an idea that why bring in more kids to do work when we can't find work for people here in Canada. And finally, as I said before, it was finally completely shut down in 1948. So I'm going to give you a little case study. Judy and Jane, over here, discovered their great-grandmother was a British home child and did some research, and I'm going to talk a little bit about her experience. This is Bessie Palin. She was in the Bernardo system. Bessie was born on 28 July 1888 in Winchester, Hampshire, in England. She was a middle child and 7 siblings. Her mother, Jane Galgani, died in 1897, and the family unit essentially kind of fell apart. Her dad took to drink. Her father, Frank Allen, lost his job as a foreman at a mineral bottling plant. According to the Barnardo records, her father took the younger 4 children and entered the New Winchester workhouse, where they stayed for about a year. It couldn't have been very pleasant, as Bessie would later in life, as I heard from Judy, later in life would threaten her own children if they were misbehaving to send them off to the workhouse. So that experience stayed with her even to the end of her life. The family did leave the workhouse after a year, but things were not very good. The oldest 3 children had found jobs by that point, but they were not living at home. The youngest 3 children, a 5-year-old boy and 3-year-old twin girls, were sent back to the workhouse. Bessie and her older sister Bertha were admitted to Bernardo's care on 17 July 1899. So the early reports from Barnardos are conflicting. On the one hand, they said the living conditions were deplorable, and on the other hand, they say Bessie was well nourished and there was plenty of food in the house. Barnardos did have to obtain a magistrate's order that allowed them to keep the children and send them to Canada, as the local agency would not remove the children from their home. Detailed notes were taken upon the admittance, and the girls spent the first 12 nights at the receiving home in Stepney Causeway in East London. This is all from the records of the Barnardo organization. They were transferred to the girls' village home in Barkingside in Ilford, Essex. There. And on 11 September 1899, Bessie and her older sister Bertha were put aboard the SS Arawa and sent to Canada. So there's Bessie and Bertha there. 11 years old and 13 years old. There's the Arawa there. There's 103 girls in their party. Each of the child would have had a trunk similar to the one on the screen. This one's from the Lambton County Museum down in southwestern Ontario. This is a Bernardo case, and it would have been very similar looking to this. That is alligator skin, by the way. There was an idea that alligator skin leather would be waterproof because alligators were waterproof, I guess. That's true. They believe that. All right, so there are standard items in a Bernardo trunk. I don't know if you can see that. I'll read some of them off. They had stationery, brush and comb, haberdashery, handkerchief, Bible, a hymn book, 2 stuffed dresses, 2 print dresses, 2 flannel dresses, 2 cotton dresses, garters, shoes and bootlaces, toothbrush, brush and comb, small towels in a bag, 2 pairs of hose thick, 2 pairs of hose thin, 2 flannel petticoats, 1 winter petticoat, 1 summer petticoat, 2 coarse aprons, 2 Holland aprons, 2 Muskin aprons, ulster, tam o' shanter, a hat, a pair of boots, a pair of Oxfords, a pair of slippers, a pair of plimsolls, and a pair of gloves. So that would be the standard items in a Bernardo child trunk in 1898. Upon arriving in Canada on 21 September, the girls boarded a train. The girls' receiving home in Hazelbrae in Peterborough, Ontario. There's that image again. They stayed in the home for a couple months. I guess this was apparently a common practice to make sure that the kids were healthy and didn't have lice, vermin-free, these sorts of things. So Bessie entered her first placement on 7 December 1899. With Mrs. Robert Coyle in Coburn. He was an apple exporter, and she was to receive board, clothing, and schooling. Between the ages of 8 and 12, Bernardo children were placed out to receive board, clothing, and schooling in exchange for farm labor. As the child grew older, they were expected to negotiate with their employer for wages, which, I mean, expecting a 12-year-old to negotiate for their wages is kind of absurd. But they were expected to make between $2 and $3 paid twice a year. From this, they had to buy their own clothing, they had to pay their own room and board. Bessie stayed at this placement for approximately a year, and the record shows she did not receive the promised schooling. Over the next 4 years, Bessie had 13 different placements and was sent back to Peterborough each time. 13 placements in 4 years. Some of the reasons were due to unmanageable behavior. She was quite rebellious. Change of circumstances with the families, her own ill health. She had tonsillitis. The records show that she did not want to come to Canada, and she asked to be sent back to Canada, or sent back to England, knowing that she could at least end up back in the workhouse. She did not get to visit with her sister. Oh, she did get to visit with her sister Bertha twice, once in December of 1899, once in the summer of 1904. her last placement during the summer of 1904 was at the McLaughlin Farm in Hyden, Ontario. That's where she met her future husband, Peter Stewart. He was a new immigrant from Scotland, and they married in December. She was 16 years old. The next spring, their first child was born, and that's Judy and James' grandma. Her twin was either stillborn or died shortly after birth. They lived in Brandon for a while, and also in Oshawa, before finally settling in Kuwait in 1909, when Peter found employment in the flour mill. So that would be the Lake of the Woods flour mill in Kuwait. They had a total of 13 living kids. There's a thought maybe she wanted so many kids to kind of create a family that she had missed growing up. Throughout her placement, she did keep in touch with her oldest sister Lily, who is still living back in the UK. And later in life, she connected with her younger twin sisters. Letters from Lily were detained by Barnardos until the girls were in Canada. She'd also received correspondence from her father. Bessie never returned to England, although the younger sisters did visit her in Canada. Upon Peter's retirement in 1943, they moved to Thunder Bay, perhaps to be close to Peter's siblings and family from Scotland. Peter died on 14 August 1946, and Bessie on 12 October 1970. She was 82 years old. So that's the story of Bessie and the story of British home children in Canada. The child immigration movement, I think little known by many Canadians, made a very significant impact in Canada's social fabric and in Canada's history. We certainly are here on the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the program to mark that anniversary and to remember these kids who were sent here to Canada under very difficult circumstances. It's now thought that about 11% of Canada's population is a direct descendant of a British home child. So it made a huge, huge mark on Canadian history, certainly. Found in all walks of life, and certainly one of the darker chapters in Canadian history. That's all I have on the history of the British Home Children Program. And that story, I heard, as some people were talking, that some people were descended from home children here. So what is your father's story? Can you share a little bit about that?
His name was John Brown. He was taken to the orphanage by an uncle. He only lived in one of the Bernardos' home for a few months. He was on the high seas aboard the Sardinia on his 10th birthday in June of 1895. He was born in June of 1885. He was an illegitimate child. He was part of a very beautiful family. The grandmother ruled the roost and looked after him. And when Grandma died, an uncle marched him off to Dr. Bernardo's home and said there was no place for him in the family anymore, and he was brought to Canada. He was a beautiful pianist, had a beautiful voice, had beautiful upbringing in Canada. He was one of the lucky ones. Listening to you talk, I realized how lucky he really was.
Absolutely.
If you'd like to read his story, the family shared in the Kenora Great War Project.
Excellent.
He's in the project.
Yes, he was. Thank
everything
you.
that you shared. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent.
You informed us of things we did not know ourselves.
And you shared with me things I didn't know about him.
Excellent.
I'm the youngest of 5 children. We went forth and were fruitful. It's a real family, continues to be a real family, in spite of modern changes.
Sure.
I was brought up thinking of his foster parents as my Grandpa Chittick, my Grandma Chittick, my Uncle Dale, my Aunt Lou, and my Aunt Pearl. And he must have been dearly loved. Christmas gifts arrived from at least one of the sisters, as long as I could remember. What else can I tell you? He must have been a little bit of a fairy tale teller, because until I met one of the aunts in person, the story I thought of as my dad's history wasn't anything like it was when she told it. So whether he was programmed with a good story or whether he had a really good imagination, I don't know. But he was a wonderful father, a wonderful grandfather, and worked hard all his life. Never complained about any upbringing. He never wanted to go back to England, and he didn't want his history searched out. My daughter-in-law went to England, and she visited Dr. Bernardo's home, and on my behalf, she tried to get some history for us. Because she wasn't a direct descendant, they wouldn't give her anything, but they did give her a lot of information as to how I could approach them and get it. Because Dad hadn't particularly wanted it to happen, I was very reticent about it and didn't do it for a lot of years. But then one of my sons wanted to know his background. So it was not too long before the records were the records are all open, by the way, after 100 years.
Sure.
But it wasn't quite the 100-year factor yet. But I had the records open, and it was very emotional. A report we got back, very, very hard to decipher because it was all written in English script, longhand. But it told a different story than what I had ever known,
Very interesting.
sort of deal.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Anyone else? Like to share there? Yeah.
I don't know whether my grandfather was a British home child, but the little I do know makes it very suspicious. He was born in London to a very poor family in 1884, and in 1901 he was sent with his brother to Winnipeg. He was separated from his brother. We know Uncle Alan went to a very good farm, and Granddad went to a terrible place where he nearly froze to death and starved. And then the story gets sort of murky. He somehow escaped from that situation and ended up in Winnipeg. He never spoke of his childhood and didn't really give any information at all. So I'm sort of wondering how I can find out.
I'd love to help you.
We've got some people that can help you here for sure. For sure. Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, thanks for coming, everyone, on this 150th anniversary. And I think the more that this gets talked about, the more people will realize that they had family involved in the program, and the more we'll learn. So certainly, thanks for coming out to the museum, and I wish you good looking, good hunting, I guess, for your family history. So thanks again. Thanks for coming out to the museum on a sunny day.
You said that Bernardo Association still exists?
Yeah.
What does it do now?
I think they're still in the business of pardon me? Orphans, yeah. It's still in the,
They
yeah.
have charity shops.
They do, absolutely, yeah. Yeah,
I bought Judy something from the church.
sure. Yeah, they're still kind of in the same business, I guess.
So are you going to sort of try to do a sort of history for the museum records?
Well, yeah,
People in Kenora?
I'm quite interested. There was a museum exhibit that the Archives of Ontario put together a few years ago, and Lori and I were just talking about it before I came up here. It might be worth seeing if that is a traveling exhibit. It wouldn't surprise me if it was. So that would have lots of good info in it as well, and just be quite interesting. The archives, they produce very research-dense exhibits. So if you want info, they're good people to talk to. So that's something we're going to look into as well. They did there's a big exhibit as well a couple of years ago at Black Creek Pioneer Village in Toronto. That one they had, one of the official kind of sponsors was Don Cherry, because he's descended from a British home shop. And he came and spoke at their big opening, and they won an award with the Ontario Museum Association and that sort of thing. So it's something that's becoming more and more kind of well known, and something that more and more people are looking at and learning more about. So. Okay, well, thanks for coming, everyone.